How do we put a price on freedom? How do we start to value something like a human life? How do we begin to sell ourselves and our labor? The answer is actually pretty simple. It's violence. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. We are deep in our read-through of David Graeber's Debt the First 5,000 Years. Thank you so much for being here. Just a quick reminder to like, to comment, subscribe, and check out the Patreon channel at patreon.com/champagneanarchism for much more of this stuff and to just help keep this project going. It is really, really appreciated. Thank you to all the current subscribers. It is really fantastic to have you, and it's much appreciated. Today, we are covering chapters 6 and 7 in this incredible book, which means we are talking all about the possible origins of the commercial market economy. In other words, how do we go from viewing a human being as something that is completely priceless to viewing a human being as something that can be commodified? We're going to get into that today. These two chapters are absolutely incredible. However, I understand that they're not the easiest to read through. They're quite long. They're full of a lot of detail and a lot of kind of complex philosophical arguments at various points. So I'm going to try to break them down in this video today and pull out kind of the core arguments in these two chapters. And if you are trying to read along in real time and this particular section set you back a little bit in your reading progress, I understand it's kind of a lot to get through in just a week. So the next two chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9, are going to be a little shorter and maybe a little bit easier to get through. We'll see when we come to it, but it should be a little bit better so you can kind of play catch up a little bit if you need to. And anyway, all of this is never going away, so do it on your own time. Now, I will break this video down into 4 different segments. In the human economy segment, we're going to talk about some of the earliest human societies, what they might have looked like, and why money may have been more of an expression of how impossible it was to value a human life than anything else. In the second section, which is the slavery segment, we're going to cover how violence can start to break this system down. And of course, we're going to take a particular look at the transatlantic slave trade and the ways that it still kind of resonates with us today. Then we're going to move on to the Age of Heroes section, which could also be called the Age of Patriarchy section. We're going to look at basically the development of patriarchy and also things like the ways the old heroic Greek societies started to change when you started to introduce money and markets and commodification and all of that into the equation. So we're going to kind of try to break that down a little bit. And then finally, we're going to talk about law, especially the law of ancient Rome. We're going to just spend a few minutes on this at the end and try to figure out the ways that we've built this logic, this sort of late Roman Republic period law, into our modern notions of private property. So let's get going and let's start with the human economy. Now, Graeber begins chapter 6 by considering an argument from Philippe Rospapet that primitive money is a way to recognize something that is ultimately an unpayable debt. It's about negotiating things that are just impossible to negotiate. And the classic example that we've got here is the bride price. Now, the bride price, we often, when we think about it sort of now, we often frame it in terms of a dowry to pay for a woman. This is an exchange, right? This is a woman being purchased or bought. It's kind of a literal purchase. But what Rospapet and Graeber say here is that when you really look at it, when you start to break it down and you look through the ethnographies of societies that still have the bride price or bride wealth, however you decide to describe it, the bride price is a negotiation that can't really be a negotiation. Really, the bride price is kind of a recognition that there can't really be a true payment given for a woman, for a daughter, for a member of the family. That exchange is an acknowledgement that a true repayment would be basically impossible. Now, they say that the reason that we think a bride price or bride wealth is an exchange is because of economists and historians looking back at such exchanges through a modern lens and trying to give us a sanitized, basically unrecognizable version of reality. And Graeber is here to say this is significantly more messy. Reality can't be boiled down to such a clear level of exchange. This, by the way, is what we've seen over the past 5 chapters, right? He's basically trying to tell us, listen, the world is not as clear-cut as all of this. There are many different ways to look at this, especially the last chapter, chapter 5, which we covered last week. But now, when breaking down a specific like the bride price, this is something that economists are coming in saying, listen, this must be an exchange. The husband must be buying the wife. And Graeber and Jospape are saying, look at, for example, the tiv of central Nigeria. And by the way, we're going to talk a lot about the tiv through the whole course of this video, so we're going to come back to them. But when you look at it in specifically this particular example, the bride price doesn't work like this at all. Among the tiv, the bride price is basically a lump sum to get the family of your relatives-in-law off your back. And you could end up paying the bride price throughout basically the rest of your life. It's a continual process because it is a debt that can never truly be repaid. Something similar happens with things like the weergeld, which is the payment that's given to a family of a murder victim. Graeber here draws on the example of the nuer, where priests mediated disputes and oversaw this type of payments to families of people who were slain as a way to prevent further violence from breaking out. There is, of course, absolutely no real way to erase that blood debt, and that's not what this was doing. It's a symbolic payment that can kind of keep things suspended. Similarly, bride wealth wasn't about wiping out a debt, it was about establishing kind of a holding pattern. Rebalancing, in other words, losses that are impossible to repay. And this is the context where we find a lot of early forms of money. It's something that Graeber has told us before, but these examples are really filling in the gaps, right? And money isn't about buying or selling things, it's about framing and establishing and maintaining human relationships. And so this term that Graeber gives us, the human human economies are about this largely symbolic exchange of money, and money, by the way, is something that also takes a very symbolic form. These are useless, pretty things. These are things that can be used for personal vanity, everything from the beautiful kind of bead and feather and shell currencies to gold, which is essentially the same thing. It's not a terribly helpful metal unless you're designing a circuit board. And it's just to make us kind of feel better, feel pretty, feel kind of this degree of vanity. It's not something that's terribly helpful. And so these currencies that exist and operate in human economies are kind of based around maintaining human relationships. It all boils down to the idea that none of this is about economic equivalence. It is about acknowledging that human life, really has no equivalent at all. So how does something like a human economy break down? Let's talk about slavery. And here we're going to talk more about the tiv. But Graeber brings back the idea of the tiv and the example of the tiv and says that the tiv couldn't buy women, but they could buy slaves. A slave has no kin. A slave has no mutual obligations. A slave is completely abstracted from their context, and therefore they are regarded and treated as something that is less than human. An enslaved person doesn't operate by the normal rules of humanity. Those normal rules of humanity just don't apply because we are treating these people as less than human within the context of our society. So if we look around us at our neighbors and the people that we know and the people that we owe things to, our social obligations, we have these networks that we all exist in, we do have responsibilities toward these people. However, if you introduce an enslaved person into this context, if they are removed, if they are cut off violently from their society, their social context, then we owe them nothing. All of this is the baseline logic of slavery. And Graeber spends a lot of time with the question of what slavery actually is in these 2 chapters. He notes, for example, that slavery is often seen as kind of essentially the death of a human being. If you've conquered a village, you could kill all those people. They are, for all intents and purposes, as good as dead. And therefore, if they are slaves, they are still alive, but they don't really count as living. They are zombies. They are the walking dead. We'll get back to this idea a little bit more in the next section, but Graeber moves from this to the belief of the tiv in the idea of tsav, basically power, charisma. And tsav, the tiv believed, was a physical substance. It grew around the heart, and it could only be augmented, this substance that gave you power and charisma and sort of power and control over your fellow human, it could only be augmented by consuming human flesh. In other words, to gain that power, a man would have to consume the flesh of another human being, which was viewed by the Tiv as a deeply monstrous practice, very much like we think about cannibalism today. Men, therefore, in this belief system, who were often tricked into consuming flesh, had to sacrifice their loved ones to what amounted to a council of witches, because once tricked, he was in debt to this council of witches. This whole process would then end with a man having sacrificed his family, and in the end, after years and years of power and success that came from the Tsav, he would end up consumed himself. This is a deeply, deeply monstrous process, and most people who lived in these kinds of villages under these belief systems believed that the powerful people in the village were witches themselves. They were devouring people for power. And Graeber wonders why this was framed in terms of debt, specifically debt to this council of witches. Obviously, the metaphor of Tsav is quite a potent metaphor, right? Gaining success by consuming the literal flesh of others. That's a very powerful and evocative idea. But going beyond that, why frame this in terms of debt? Why build this out as a debt that has to be honored to a council of witches? Why add this element? Well, to explain that, he turns to the transatlantic slave trade, which is all taking place just north of the Tiv. The transatlantic slave trade had created a vast system of debt. We're talking European ships that are supplying local money. The example that Graeber uses is copper bars to African slavers who are taking this on credit, right? And families have to pledge their own members as collateral as part of this operation. These family members who were pledged, they were pawns. They're not slaves, but of course they virtually act as slaves with the potential to become slaves themselves. And if those debts aren't repaid, of course there are significant consequences to that, including further enslavement. But there is an extra twist to this truly horrific system, and that is that the slave trade and the enslaving raids that took place in several parts of West Africa created outright panic and chaos, and that chaos was filled by powerful local merchant societies who stepped in to restore order. Graeber's preferred example here is the Aro Confederacy, the Children of God, and they brought a brutal system of justice. They were protecting from these raiders who were enslaving people, but they also, of course, created a system of debt that ended up enslaving people further. They were just embedded in this system as well, even as they claimed to protect people from these enslavement raids. One of the very insidious ways that this happened was through the secret societies, which offered all sorts of benefits, but which you had to pay to get into. And of course, to pay to get in, you had to take out debts, and you had to secure those debts with pawns, with, again, probably family members. And if you couldn't pay that debt, you were enslaved yourself along with your pawns. So, maybe the Tiv were right to worry about a secretive society that was based on debt, granting power and promising enslavement. Now, the result of all of this is a machine of impossible debt and an endless justification for enslavement. But it wasn't limited to Africa, of course. Graeber says that this was a global phenomenon, and he spends a lot of time talking about, for example, Bali under Dutch control. Bali, the entire colony at the time, became essentially transformed into a mechanism to extract and sell women. One particularly evil way that this was done was by hosting cockfights with betting that drove peasants into gambling debt, and those debts ended up paid with human lives. This is just one more way that this happens. And what Graeber is doing here throughout this entire section is presenting us with a way that human economies may break down into commercial economies. This is how we can commodify people through the slave trade and everything that surrounds it, especially these mechanisms that are driven by debt. All of this is a way to commodify human beings. And so you go from a situation in which you respect the human life, in which lives are treated as something that cannot be compensated for, right? Something that just truly cannot be repaid, to something that has a definite price tag attached. Again, this is human economies becoming commercial economies. We move from this symbolic recognition that human lives are of incomparable value to commercial economies which bring everything down to the level of exchange and trade. Everything, in other words, is for sale. And again, just to hit this point one more time, all of this happens through violence. By extracting people from their local contexts, from their social contexts, and making them less than human and therefore commodities in themselves. And this doesn't have to be outright slavery, of course. There are many ways of extracting people from their social contexts, but slavery is sort of the logical endpoint. And I also want to spend some time with this idea that Graeber leaves us with at the end of chapter 6, which is to say that we have never really left the legacy of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade and the incalculable human toll of this buying and selling of humans behind us at all. He says, owing to its historic role, slavery has shaped our basic assumptions and institutions in ways that we are no longer aware of and whose influence we would probably never wish to acknowledge if we were. If we have become a debt society, it is because the legacy of war, conquest, and slavery has never completely gone away. It's still there, lodged in our most intimate conceptions of honor, property, even freedom. It's just that we can no longer see that it's there. And with that, let's talk about honor, property, and even freedom. Let's talk about the Age of Heroes. The Age of Heroes section, I could have easily titled, I said this at the beginning, I could have easily titled this The Age of Patriarchy because that's really what it is. Graeber is very clear here that when we talk about violence and war, slavery and the trade of human beings and the commodification of human beings, most of the time, what we're really talking about is the enslavement of women. Graeber starts this section with Oluwada Ekiano, a man who was enslaved, bought his freedom, and became an abolitionist, but early on in his life, sort of earlier on in his story, even he accepted the slave trade as just a fact of life. In fact, his sense of honor really depended on it. And at various points, he took part himself in the slave trade as part of this journey to get out of slavery, because honor, and this is what Graeber throws at us, honor only exists in the eyes of others. To be honorable, you have to accept the institutions, the societal institutions around you that define what honor is. So let's talk about honor and slavery. And remember that Graeber says that the slave, the enslaved person, is essentially treated as dead. It's social death. And he draws from Ali Abd al-Wahid Wafi, who was an Egyptian sociologist who argued that slavery is what happens as an alternative to death. Just reiterating that point that the enslaved person is, in every way conceivable in the eyes of society around them, a dead person. And then Graeber draws on the work of Orlando Patterson, who argues that slavery is always necessarily based on violence alone. There is no moral relationship going on in the master-slave dynamic. It is one based on absolute control. And we'll come back to this term, absolute, but this is ultimate power and ultimate control that grants someone power over another human being. The enslaved person's situation is, therefore, a situation of utter degradation. And this situation of utter degradation is the foundation of honor. And we can think about this, right? Modern day, we have roughly two definitions of honor right now. And they are, by the way, contradictory. The first one is sort of an honorable person as a decent person who honors their commitments. And then the second one is the one that we're mostly concerned with today, although it matters that there are two different ways to think about this. But the second is the view of somebody, normally a man, as masterful, this masculine presence with the power and nobility and, crucially, the power to reduce somebody to a commodity. The foundation of honor in this sense is the ability to strip someone else of their dignity. And Graeber says that this is precisely where the fragility of honor comes from. He says, "It seems to me that this is precisely what gives honor its notoriously fragile quality. Men of honor tend to combine a sense of total ease and self-assurance which comes with the habit of command with a notorious jumpiness, a heightened sensitivity to slights and insults, the feeling that a man, and it is always a man, is somehow reduced, humiliated, if any debt of honor is allowed to go unpaid. This is because honor is not the same as dignity. One might even say honor is surplus dignity." Ancient Ireland gives us a weird window into this logic. It had a human economy, almost no money, markets, and yet everyone had a literal price. And that price was an honor price. If you insulted somebody, you had to pay that honor price. There were elaborate rules, compensation for injuries, even getting stung by someone's bee. There were an empowered and powerful set of jurists in ancient Ireland who were tasked with writing down these laws to such an extent that they would often throw some jokes in those laws and everything. It is pretty crazy, but slaves, female slaves, were central to this system. And that's because honor is always relational. It depends on your ability to degrade someone else. Ireland had put a specific monetary value on human dignity. Now, that monetary value is, in fact, the exchange of human lives, and this is another way that you can start to see this system, this human economy start to break down. As soon as we start to assign value, even if it's just relational value between different human lives, this system starts to break down. Now, all of a sudden, life isn't so priceless anymore. That brings us to ancient Mesopotamia. So we know from the earliest accounts of ancient Mesopotamia that they were littered with women. Women in various positions across society, not parity, but better than you might expect. Yet, by the end of the Bronze Age, you have accounts of women being sequestered away from the rest of society. The patriarchy is beginning to come into force, in other words. But why? Well, there is that explanation that we've seen before on this channel. It's a popular feminist historical explanation, which is that as war began to spread through the region, right, centralized states start to go to war with one another over power, territory, conquest, all of this stuff. All of a sudden, war becomes more important, and because of that, the natural strength and violence of men becomes more important, and that sets men apart. It puts them in kind of a prime position in an area consumed by war. But Graeber then adds a secondary explanation, something that goes along with this classic feminist historical explanation, and that's a really fascinating one. And listen, we'll talk through it, and then I'll give a little bit of a potential critique at the end of this, but let's talk through it first. So he's saying that as war exploded, so did taxation, and so did debt. And as debts exploded, we start to see more accounts of the possible commodification of women. The explanation that he's presenting us with is that the men of the time who were putting women away and sequestering them were trying to prove that their women, the women that belonged to them, were not for sale. So around this time then, the patriarchy was essentially the male assertion of the value of purity. Graeber talks about the development of prostitution in Mesopotamia and the ways that the patriarchy may have been a rejection of those loose morals off in Babylon, where prostitution may have been used to pay debts, where women were more commodified. And so they created a dual track, essentially, right? A push and pull. On the one hand, you have poor women who are being left to this type of degradation. And on the other hand, you have rich men who are trying to protect their women. They could afford to protect that sense of honor. So you have here the push of debt dependency and the pull of those who are trying to assert their patriarchal rights. Now that is a really cool and a really interesting argument, and it is very, very cool to break it down, especially in a feminist context, and especially when you look at somebody like Silvia Federici, who we met earlier on this channel, when you try to compare these two things. But just like Federici, the thing that you can say about this is that it is quite sweeping, right? You are summing up thousands of years of history in one big overarching narrative, and that can be kind of a tough thing to reconcile. However, it may certainly have been true, and it does make a lot of sense with a lot of other explanations that we have of this kind of historical trend. So I just want to sort of drop this seed of potential doubt in there, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of this video. But there's, to my mind, it makes a lot of sense. Either way, that brings us to ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, and Graeber spends a lot of time on this in this book, and you can go back and read through this whole section because I'm going to be summing it up quite quickly here, because I do think that it is interesting, but the thrust of the argument here is that in ancient Greece, this tension was put into very sharp relief. So you have the Homeric heroes, the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, who have a disdain for trade. They fought for treasure, for honor, for glory. Money does exist, but again, it's a human economy. It's relational. It is not, they're not out there seeking money to buy things. They are getting money and rewards and treasure based on their conquests, based on their type of Homeric honor. But then, of course, 2 centuries later, you have markets growing. You have this explosion of money, and with it, debt crisis. Now, city-states are forced into action by debt crisis. They have to typically legislate debt forgiveness or, of course, face revolt, which they did. You have the rise of strongmen, and during this period, throughout all of this, you have aristocrats who can't afford to avoid money entirely. Of course, they tried. Male honor became a matter of scorning the market, and female honor became a matter of chastity. But money meant loyalty, sort of alliance, and the erosion of that hierarchy a little bit. Those Homeric values, the ability to disdain money, started to erode, and it confused everything. And so it left ancient Athens in a position of asking this very key question, which is, how do we reconcile these sort of heroic values and monetary debts? And for the Greeks, that question never really went away. Of course, there is so much more to this Greek story, because Greece and the Greek city-states were a civilization that was built on slavery as well. And there's a lot in this book about the ways that the Greek city-states would enslave people through conquest. There's a lot in this book about the ways that they would send off the poor and the poverty-stricken to other sort of colonies as a way to support their own citizenry back at home, a way to sort of fend off this kind of crisis. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff in here. However, we're going to move on just because we're trying to hit the central arguments in this narrative. I do think this is a really, really interesting part of the book, though. So if you're just watching the videos and you're not reading along, do consider, reading through this bit of chapter 7, just out of interest, because there's a lot of really cool stuff here. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about the law, and especially about Rome. Now, by the time we reach ancient Rome, the logic of debt has become the logic of the law itself. Now, Roman law, especially sort of late Republic period, underpins a lot of modern jurisprudence, and it's essentially a definition of ownership that is not, a relationship between a person and a thing. That doesn't really make sense in the abstract. It's much more a relationship between a person and the rest of the world, because if you have ownership of something and can dispose of it in any way you wish, it's basically saying you have the right to dispose of this thing in any way you wish by preventing the rest of the world of disposing of that thing in any way that they wish. It's relational as a construct. But there's much more to this, because the idea of absolute property is something that's kind of unique to this period, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, from Orlando Patterson, you have this tracing back of absolute property to slavery. And Graeber, in a very cool section, dives into this word dominion, right? This is the absolute control. Dominium, meaning ownership, absolute control, comes from ultimately domus, and domus is the household. And in this situation, the male patriarch, the head of the household, the pater familias, had power over absolutely everything in his household. Enslaved people included. Slavery, of course, at this period had begun as conquest. The captured prisoners of war were the first slaves coming in, really. But then soon, as free men were being sold into bondage for debt, you had paupers, you had debtors entering the enslaved masses that made up the foundations of Rome. All of this kind of started to change. And owners in ancient Rome had absolute power over their slaves. and their children, weirdly enough, which Graeber does mention and is very strange, but that's just the extremity of the legal system at the time. And so from this comes the contradiction, right? Because if you have absolute dominion over a human being, over an individual, and we're not talking at this point about somebody who's inferior necessarily to you, this conception comes around much later. At the time, it's just circumstantial, right? You could be a brilliant and qualified individual. If you were captured in war, you were still a slave. You were still the absolute property of somebody else. And so you have this conception that freedom itself is something that can be sold. That may sound insane, but that is something that is at the heart of our modern legal system. You know, to say that we own ourselves, Graeber writes in this book, is to imagine ourselves as both master and slave. We will be talking a little bit more about this over the course of the next few chapters, especially when it comes to its modern implications and then what this really means, that we have defined our modern legal system around a conception of property, absolute control over property that does stem from slavery. But for now, let's kind of sit back and think about this. Right? How do we consider all of this? How do we contextualize all of this? Is it true that our modern legal codes are based on the logic of slavery? Listen, this is an extremely broad story that Graeber is trying to tell here. He is pulling a lot of examples. Some really brilliant anthropological work went into these two chapters. But ultimately, he is constructing a very sweeping picture of human history that has culminated in this moment, and maybe it is too big. Of course, and this is something that Graeber talks a lot about in his work, right? With these big sweeping stories that claim to tell the whole picture and really don't, because reality is messy. And I think Graeber may fall a little bit into this trap himself as he's trying to build this narrative and give us this arc. You know, there is a lot more to this story. There's a lot more detail. There are lots of different places around the world that may have followed lots of different paths. And that is just me throwing out a little bit of a caution to say, listen, this is Graeber's answer to a nearly impossible to answer question, and you should question that answer. Just as Graeber is interrogating basically everything else about our economic narratives and the way that we have gotten to this place, you should feel free to interrogate Graeber's answer as well. But the central thesis here to these two chapters is this, that the development of a modern market economy that views human beings as commodities that can be used has its roots in violence. That is violence like the patriarchy, that is violence like slavery, that is violence like conquest and colonization, different types, in other words, of absolutely earth-shattering violence. Now, in my view, that is almost definitely true. And it lines up with many things that we have read before, especially Frantz Fanon, Murray Bookchin, Silvia Federici. All of these different accounts line up very nicely with the story that Graeber is trying to tell here, all from different angles and all in their own ways. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about Federici as we get further into the series. I think chapter 10, if I'm not remembering wrong. But this is the narrative that Graeber is trying to construct. It is a very, very broad story to be telling. There's a lot of detail necessarily missing from a story like this. But from my perspective, it really jives with a lot of the stuff that we have come across before. And I find it, if it's not immediately obvious, very, very persuasive. However, let me know what you think, as you read through these. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you make of these two chapters and the story that Graeber is trying to tell here. Don't forget to check out that Patreon, of course, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. And I will see you next time. Next time we are covering chapters 8 and 9. So getting a little bit more into the history of the world as Graeber sees it. We're going to start breaking down different historical periods. It's going to be really, really cool. We're going to get to all of that. It's going to be totally awesome. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.